take our breaths away with its glow.
Whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. I'm Maria Thompson Corley. If that quote from Philippians resonated with you, stay tuned. I'd love to introduce you to intriguing, creative people whose light is making our world a lovelier place. Welcome to Finding Beauty.
Ellenberger is a retired neurologist and professional flutist who founded Central Pennsylvania's Mount Gretna Music Festival, which started as a few concerts in the summer and has grown to a year-round event that migrates to nearby Elizabethtown in the fall. He is also a wonderful writer with a keen interest in the connection between music and our brains. And the working title for the book he is working on that subject is Apollo's Fire, a neurologist's adventures in music. So, first of all, thanks for doing this, Carl. You have an amazing story because as a professional musician myself, it's hard being good enough to get paid as a musician, never mind throwing in a side of neurology. So how did you pull off doing both?
Oh, it was like everything else I do, kind of just happened inadvertently, I guess. I always intended to go into medical school as I went through high school and college, and indeed I did. But each decision that I had to make along the way, I included my flute in it and went to college at the place that I could go to the Eastman School of Music and study flute. And then I went to medical school, and to my surprise, I was the only flute player in Southern Connecticut for 4 years, and I had all the jobs that I could possibly handle along with medical school.
You mean you were the only flute player in Southern Connecticut? I mean, like, obviously there were other people who played, but professional?
It seemed that way. Actually, the other one was the wife of the conductor of the New Haven Symphony, and she played whenever she felt like playing. But when the hard concerts came along, she sort of managed not to be there. So I got a lot of experience. And
as far as finding time to practice, I mean, was that kind of your life, was practicing, going to school and studying? Or are you just so quick that, you know, you were able to fudge a little bit? Or was it 1 week you practiced more, the next week you did a little bit more of I mean, how did you manage that, though I'm still not seeing it?
Well, that gets a little bit into the subject of my book. If you're going to become a good or particularly a great musician, you have to do that before about the age of 18 or 20, which is somewhere just into your first several years at college or conservatory. And if you have not accomplished that by that particular age, if you haven't laid down your 10,000 hours in a practice room, I think for the flute is probably less than 10,000 hours. For the violin and the piano, it probably is 10,000 hours. For the flute, it's probably a little bit less. And so I had laid down all my practicing while I was in college, and then in medical school, I could just pick up the flute and run out the door, go to rehearsals without much work.
Okay. But, I mean, like, for example, I don't know if your book gets into the difference between being a singer, or are you one of those people who doesn't really consider singers musicians? I hate to even raise that, but
no,
I
try to play the flute like a singer. I think the singer has the most freedom and flexibility and technique of any instrument, and all musicians try to sing whatever instruments they play. My point about the flute was that it's not nearly so complex technically, and the repertoire is not nearly so extensive and complex. It's much smaller and circumscribed, and so had I started out as a pianist, I probably would never have made it, because I wouldn't have spent nearly enough time to get competitive as I did on the flute.
Yeah. And I should add that that was a facetious comment. And it sort of comes from, as someone who's played in churches a lot, they will talk about the musician, and the musician is somebody who is not a singer, and then the singer is somebody who's separate. But I was just sort of imagining that most singers probably haven't spent 10,000 hours, or maybe they have, just not being instructed. Anyway, I mean, I know that mastering an instrument that isn't a part of your body, obviously, there's a difference in the learning curve. I have the utmost respect for singers, and I know a lot of singers, and I have a daughter who's studying to become a singer, so I know that that's certainly not easier.
Singers are a little bit of an exception to what I said about you got to lay down your musicality and skills by a certain age, like 18 or 20. Singers actually mature far later and continue to mature well into their 30s and even 40s, I would imagine. I just think of some of the famous singers now, like Lorraine Hunt Lieberson was a cellist or violist until she was about 26, and somebody heard her sing in church, and they said, hey, maybe you're a singer and not a violist. And it turned out she was probably the best singer of the 20th century.
How and when did you fall in love with music?
Oh, I'm not sure I really fell in love with it until I got to be over 50 or even later. That I just happened to like music in high school. I found that I was good at it. It really wasn't difficult to play anything I wanted at 15, 20 minutes a day until I got into my later teens. And I'm not really sure I understood music at that young age. I'm a slow developer, slow learner in just about everything. And it has taken me a whole lifetime, which at this point is pretty long, to really know how to respond to some kinds of things and to mature to the point where I could really say that I love music.
Wow. So being a neurologist then, was that a passion or a practical decision? Because you were always fascinated by the idea of neurology.
I think it was because when I took an internship at the University of Virginia, for some reason, which is very unusual, the neurology department was one of the most friendly and collegial departments in the institution, and had a rotation on neurology very early, and I liked the whole community. They sort of took on their cue from the chairman of neurology. He was a really good guy, and he was a nurturing mentor. And I went to medical school and intending to become an ophthalmologist like my father, but that was during the Vietnam War, and every doctor had to serve. And so ophthalmology residencies were very competitive. And if you hadn't done your 2 years in the Army, you didn't have any chance of getting an ophthalmology residency. But the neurology was right there, and they allowed me to delay my Army service for a few extra years. And the Army made me chief of neurology at a major Army hospital, even though I hadn't finished my training.
Wow.
And I sort of got to like it, and I worked with a neuropathologist at Virginia who was a very good scientist, and actually he was a very good writer, and that's how I first learned to write. Nobody ever taught me how to write in high school or college. I just assumed, just like they assume that all doctors know how to write because they write a lot. But this neuropathologist used to say, okay, write your draft and bring it into my office, and we'd sit at his desk and he'd go over it word by word. And over the course of a year, he taught me how to write clearly, and I was pretty good at writing medical, much better than average, and writing clear scientific or medical prose, but I wasn't really very good at imagining or waxing eloquent, as you might say. And that took the rest of my life to try to get a little bit better at.
So a lot of what you've been able to do in the artistic realm has been because of your own just gradually absorbing. I mean, obviously this was someone who tried to instruct you, but as far as adding more flourishes and making things not just clear but artistic, or for lack of a better word. I mean, this is something that you, at some point, made a conscious decision that you wanted to enrich your understanding of music and you wanted to enrich your abilities as a writer, and so you then, I don't know, just read really good writers. Did you read more about music as well, or how did that happen?
Well, I've always liked writing because my parents always were reading, and they had a library above the garage, which was uncannily like the library I'm sitting in right now, wall-to-wall bookshelves, and they were always reading. My father, after dinner, would go to his desk and read for several hours, and that was just sort of, it's what people did, I thought. And I kept on doing it, and then I read a lot in my spare time when I wasn't practicing the flute. And I've gotten to the point where I don't, as James Reston said, I don't know what I think until I read what I write, and that's the way that that's the way I work out, solve problems, and I work out complex issues and try to understand things.
I can completely relate. I know as a child, I would sometimes even write letters to my parents while I was living in their house, but just the idea of the time it takes to process it, or processing it enough to put it into the form of language as opposed to just having thoughts swirling in your head that may be somewhat formless. I think for me, I understand that clarification. Unfortunately, I think I have also had a tendency to perhaps share thoughts that were still perhaps not as formed as they might have been. And then, although I find that once they are out and have been written and have been communicated, even to myself or someone else in that way, then I can step back, look at them, and they don't seem so immediate or so overwhelming or whatever they happen to be. So, I can completely get that idea if you don't quite know what you're thinking unless you've written it down.
I would add to that, over the course of countless drafts, in the old typewriter paper days, I used to, with my neuropathologist mentor, we'd go through probably 6 or 8 or 10 that his secretary would have to retype on her electric typewriter, and I'm the same way. What my first draft is just an approximation of what I'm trying to say, and then I let a little time go past, or a few days go past, and I sit down again and work a little bit on it, and sometimes it takes months to get to some place that I really like.
I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe some people might call that overthinking, but I mean, I suppose if you are a perfectionist or you have an eye for detail, then you're not going to be happy with it. And I mean, honestly, I think that I could revise things endlessly. I think that.
But Oliver Sacks did. If you read some of his biographies, the publisher would be pleading with him that the printing presses are about to start. Please stop.
Yeah.
Revising your manuscript. I'm sort of like that too.
Yeah, I get that completely. So let's talk a little bit about Mount Gretna. How did you get the idea to start the music festival there?
Oh, I had moved in inadvertently to what they called the Pennsylvania Chautauqua because it was a cheaper place to live than around the Hershey Medical Center. That was my first job in 1973. And I was walking around the community on one of the first weeks that I was here. We had to make a whirlwind trip out from St. Louis, I guess I was, and had 2 days to buy a house. So we bought the house and flew back on Sunday night. So I really didn't know what I had bought or anything about the community. So when I moved in, I said, well, let's strike out on the paths and streets of Mount Gretna, and came right up against a huge wooden outdoor auditorium called the Pennsylvania Chautauqua Playhouse or Auditorium. And then some guy who was the summer program director for the Chautauqua the next year came by and said, I hear you are a musician. Would you play a couple of concerts for us? And I thought, well, nothing is more dull than a flute and piano recital. I thought, well, if I'm going to play 2 concerts, I ought to get a bunch of musicians. And at that time, I was playing in the Harrisburg Symphony, so I collected a few of the better players in the symphony and added to them some of the people that I knew at Eastman or Interlochen, where I knew a lot of musicians, and sort of a motley group of people, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to rehearse, but they all liked the whole informality of the thing and the quaint nature of Mount Gretna, and brought their families. And we had some marvelous dinner parties and went to the beach, and they stayed in cottages, and we didn't even have to worry about the audience. They just sort of came out of nowhere. I have no idea why they came in those first couple of years.
Music.
Because now, I think that some of them were the chamber music community of Lebanon Valley College. One guy in particular had 2 Steinways up on top of a little mountain in his house, and he used to invite people. And so I was one of the first ones he invited because I was, I guess, not from Lebanon Valley College, and he figured it might be a sort of a refreshing addition to the usual crew that played chamber music in his house. And I brought some friends, and that was really my first experience with chamber music, because in those days, when my career started, he got out of conservatory, and the only options you had was to audition for an orchestra or find a teaching job somewhere. There weren't this, hundreds of small ensembles around the country, string quartets and piano trios and small chamber orchestras and things like that. And it just took on a life of its own. It was not all easy along the way, because establishing something as arcane as chamber music in the middle of farmlands in Amish country, Pennsylvania, was kind of out of place, I think. And a lot of people said, why don't you have the Mummers string bands from Philadelphia or the Navy band, stuff like that. I just had to pull my way through and say, this is the kind of music that I like, and I'm going to do it. And I'm going to make it so good that if people don't know what it is or don't like it, they'll come a few times and they'll have a change of mind and say, this is, really something pretty good.
You get, world-class performers, and I'm sure that even at the beginning, with the people who went to Eastman, you were getting a very high class of performer. I've noticed that you've added jazz to the mix as well. And how did that come about?
Well, that's a direct response to the people who said people around here don't like chamber music. So I said, okay, our second year, I had a friend at Yale who played he played tuba in the New Haven Symphony, and he played nights at Jocko's Pub downtown in New Haven. And one night I was building a harpsichord in my basement, and there was Eli Neuberger playing the tuba on the radio. So I called him up and said, hey, how about bringing your New Black Eagle Jazz Band down to play in the Playhouse, because people might like that around here a little bit better than they like Beethoven's string quartets. And so we started jazz the second year of our now 42 years, and we've continued it all along. Jazz is very much like chamber music. Actually, jazz is America's chamber music. Small ensembles, people listening to one another, playing off of one another, and small venues and ensemble without a conductor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I haven't been here as long as you have in this general area, but there's so much music, and perhaps more than the population can withstand, but I'm surprised that people said that people around here don't like chamber music, because, I guess orchestra isn't chamber music, but there are so many fine arts-related church series and different things like that, but maybe just right in the area of Mount Gretna, people were not as into it. But anyway, obviously, having survived for 42 years, somebody must like it, because you're still there and you're still bringing in wonderful people. And I know that you've retired from the actual process of bringing in people. Do you miss doing that? Or
no, that was a huge burden to me. I did that maybe for 15 years, to sit down after one season and sit down in September, October, saying, with a blank piece of paper in front of you, okay, what are we going to do next season? And that's really daunting. And we've had several artistic directors since then. And right now we have a genius, Carl Kane, who he listens to music 24 hours a day, and he hears everybody in the world who plays, and he's gotten very good musical ears, as I like to say, and he can separate the good from the bad. And he can balance the season. We don't have anything that's remotely the same from one week to the next. It's a very diverse season of all sorts of different kinds of music.
Till recently, I know you used to make at least cameo appearances. I have heard you perform with these people who I think you portrayed as being better than you, and I think that you've held your own rather well, so I was impressed with that after all that you've done, and whether being a neurologist or all the other things that you've been doing, that you were always able to pull your flute playing together for at least the concerts that I heard in Gretna, so I find that very impressive. But okay, so to talk a little bit about the book, Neurologist's Adventures in Music, can you explain a little bit more about the premise of the book?
Since I spent half a career in studying the brain and half of my career in listening and playing and studying music, I am acutely aware of all of the overlapping of those two disciplines. Obviously, we hear music through our ears with our brain, and a lot of the attributes of music can be explained by learning, understanding better how that goes through the brain, how the brain processes music. And so one of the first questions I asked, and that's the first chapter, and that is, why is music? And that's a very difficult question. It turns out that for all intents and purposes, only Homo sapiens, humans, really play or listen to music, regardless of the fact that some scientists are trying to trace evolutionary in an evolutionary way music back to the birds and or the whales or some other lower species that make some kinds of organized sounds. I think at least I've concluded that only humans, and the reason for that is that human music has blossomed, burgeoned in parallel to the tremendous increase in size of what we call the neocortex. It has increased since the Homo sapiens branched off from lower ancestors by 3 or 4-fold in size and complexity, and during that time is when music has come along and been developed and practiced by all cultures on the globe. In trying to think about that, modern researchers, it's the field of what we call now neuromusic, has sort of been inaugurated in the last maybe 15, 20 years, and more scientists. It's a multidisciplinary field. The psychologists have been in it for the longest periods of time, and they do psychological studies and sort of using the brain as a black box and seeing how it responds, the output responds to the input. But more recently, the digital revolution has made it possible for us to observe the activity in the brain during the playing and listening of music. And one of the great revelations has been that hardly any other human activity calls upon and employs as many locations and connections in the brain than music does. And, essentially, on a functional MRI scan, they say it lights up all over the place. The activity, where the activity is, you can see all sorts of different locations across the brain are recruited to process and to hear, to understand music, and that has led to the understanding that music is one way to study the brain. And the brain, we're trying to study music by looking at the brain. We can also study the brain by seeing how it processes music, and it's a very nice marriage of two different fields.
I mean, I know obviously the field of music therapy must tap into some of that knowledge of what lights up where with what musical stimulus. But, it occurred to me, I was thinking about the fact that, they said birdsong and isn't really music, because I guess birdsong is communication, and I guess I don't know if birds sing just for fun or to entertain themselves. A lot of human music, though, isn't it, a lot of it is related, I guess, to this idea of ritual or spiritual experience. Is that a correct thought? Because I was thinking of, for example, the beginnings of Western music that was written down, and I know it's saying that there was music outside of religious ritual. There was not music, obviously. I assume there was music outside of religious ritual. But I was thinking some of the functions maybe are similar to animal functions in the sense of communication, and at least in its
in the sense of communication. In the very broad sense, you can say, well, music is a form of communication, like spoken language is a form of communication, and there are many parallels in the brain. The location, the reception room for sounds in the superior temporal cortex and the auditory cortical area. That's where speech comes from the ears, and other sounds come, including musical sounds. And many of the pathways that language moves along in the course of its being processed and laid down in memory, understood, responded to, are parallel to the same pathways in music. Another thing to say in that same vein is that music enhances language, and it adds many more dimensions to spoken language, obviously. If you think about opera or vocal music, music is added to, if you take a Schiller poem and you add Beethoven's music to it, it's doubly or exponentially more meaningful and better communication than just the words themselves.
But I would say even if you don't understand the words, because obviously the poem in Beethoven is in German, and if you don't understand German, the music is still able to communicate something, even without those words. Now, with the words, it's a perfect marriage of words and music, obviously, or it wouldn't be such an iconic piece of music, but I think that there's also the capacity of music to communicate things that it's hard to know exactly what words apply. You started off saying the neurological connection, and obviously this is a topic that could be explored a lot, and you were talking a while ago about having a conference or trying to organize something that would allow a number of people to come in and do just that, expand upon this idea at length over the course of days. Is that still in the works or on the back burner maybe?
It's on the back burner. I'm not really in the neuro music club, having retired, and my clinical activity and my research activity were in vision of all things rather than sound. That I sort of chose the wrong path at that very early stage, I guess. I'm not really at the cutting edge of neuro music and sound research, and a lot of other people are in various neurophysiologists and neurologists and psychologists, and they have lots of conferences. And so I'm at this point always asking the question, what would be a purpose of a conference? And it always gets back to, well, there are a lot of people around our area who might, whether they're scientists or musicians or not, they might be interested in just being introduced to this whole new universe of neuro music, and that would be one reason. And certainly, doctors would do better if they had a little bit better understanding of music and all of the arts and literature. Obviously, musicians can learn a lot about how to practice. If a lot of the other sections in my book explain the way that by understanding how the brain handles music, you can adapt or you can improve your practice techniques. I wish I'd known that. It's taken me a long time. I've learned a lot of these things myself by being a neurologist who's always practicing the flute. And there are a lot of things you can learn by just understanding both music and the way that the brain handles it.
Well, I know you're currently, at least as I'm talking to you today, looking for a publisher, but if you don't mind sharing that chapter, I wouldn't mind reading it. Okay, so obviously you have a real intellectual curiosity. Is that what continues to keep you inspired?
I guess so. My curiosity grows as I get older. I guess to a fault, I'm curious about too many things. It's always been I've spread myself far too thin because I've been writing books, I've been drawing pictures and making paintings, and I've been playing music, and I've been, I guess I range too far to be really a master of one thing. But that's what keeps me going, because I can't stay, I guess, in one niche. I have to branch out and learn about lots of other things.
I would say I have a similar situation in that, if you find something really interesting and you find it interesting enough that you can develop a passion for it, it's kind of hard to resist it, or to at least resist dabbling. But then the dabbling becomes, as you said, I mean, you're spreading yourself so thin that you can't do everything, and I guess that's a shame, in my opinion. But okay.
And then you get frustrated because you feel that if you're going to do something, you want to do it really well.
Right,
so
right, and there just
you knuckle
isn't
down in
time.
that particular.
Yeah, and if there was a way not to have to sleep, but then I haven't solved that problem yet. So, and I do enjoy sleep, actually. So, but anyway, it seems that even as thinly as you spread yourself, you seem to have created some highlights in all of these different areas. So I hope that satisfies you at least a little bit. But, okay, I have two questions left. The first one is, how do you define beauty, and how important is it? And I always add this explanation, which maybe I shouldn't, but there are schools of thought in art that, there's certain things that try to draw out so-called the more positive reactions and are more harmonious and shun dissonance, and then there's the other of trying to reflect, what's out there, and what's out there isn't always beautiful.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about those kinds of things, and I am particularly find difficult reading aesthetics of any kind. Mm-hmm. I tend to not labor over a search for beauty or a definition of beauty. I know it when I see it, and sometimes it comes at unexpected times, and sometimes from unexpected sources and unexpected people. I think there's a lot of beauty in many of the people that I know in my life, as well as in the world around me, and in the sonic cloud that I listen to deliberately when I decide I want to listen to the music, or sometimes even when I'm playing something, it just strikes me, wow, that is really beautiful. And sometimes I have to stop because I can't go on.
Okay. Well, I think that was a good answer. And my last question is, do you think that art can change the world?
No.
And why not?
I don't know. That's where I'm pessimistic about things. I've tried so hard. Somebody asked me what's my mission or my motivation or purpose or whatever for music at Gretna, and I would say, well, it's trying to get people to hear what I hear in really good music, and to be able to recognize what is really good music and what isn't. And I've, over the course of my life, seen our culture go in the reverse direction. Great efforts in a little place like Mount Gretna, PA. And I think beauty is necessary. It can certainly try to humanize more among us, and it's not a useless, not a totally futile thing to try to do, is to contribute something that is beautiful and good to the rest of humanity, but it's just going against the tide, I think, in at least over the course of my lifetime, and especially in the last few years. But that doesn't discourage me.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, just in closing, I mean, somebody was talking about history repeating itself, and they were saying, I think it was, I'm not sure it was Ken Burns, but because they've been talking about this documentary about the Vietnam War that's coming on PBS as we were having this conversation. And then this person said, it's not so much that history repeats itself, it's just that human nature is still human nature. And I guess that was sort of the more pessimist view, I guess, that, you know, humans don't necessarily learn from whatever good examples are around them, or whatever experiences that they've seen, the way that things turned out, you know, because humans are resolutely human. But I'm glad, though, that, I mean, I think also in human nature, there has to be part of human nature, at least in enough humans, to make it observable and to matter, that drive towards something that is in some way good, whether it's good for hopefully the rest of humanity, or creating experiences that are in some way like what you're talking about, where you have something that, you know, you're playing music, or you're observing another person, and you are open enough to that person that their beauty is able to touch you at a deep level. And I think that is also something that's inherent in enough humans to make at least some difference. But I'm glad that you said no, because everybody I've asked has said they've thought about it, and they said, you know, slowly and whatever. But I'm glad that people don't feel that they have to answer yes to that question, because I think that maybe, you know, people might think that they're being called on to explain how art can change the world, and I really mean the question to be answered however the person honestly feels that they want to answer it. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate this time that you gave me, and I thank you so much, and going forth and continue to inspire, because even if you think that it's not making a difference, I can assure you that it is. So I'm Maria Thompson Corley, and this has been Finding Beauty.
The theme music for Finding Beauty is Symphony of Light, written and performed by Kiana Corley, with assistance on the cello from Allegra Banks. Rusty Banks was the producer. Right now, you're listening to Liszt's Petrarch Sonnet No. 104, performed by yours truly. You can hear the rest of it on my CD, Music from the Novel Letting Go, available on CreateSpace and Amazon. If you're interested, you can check me out at mariacorley.com or mariasworld.us. You can also find me on Twitter at Maria Corley or YouTube. My recordings are available through Albany or Amazon. My novel, Letting Go, is available on Smashwords, CreateSpace, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. Or drop me a line on my site, and I'll send you a signed copy. I want to leave you with one more quote. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's the little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Desmond Tutu. Have a beautiful day.